Welcome, everyone, to the Fort McMurray Wood Buffalo Labor Study presentation. My name is Stuart McIntosh. I'm a member of the staff with the Fort McMurray Chamber of Commerce, but today I have the distinct pleasure to moderate this session, which will be a 1-hour session. At the most, it will be a 1-hour session. As we begin, a couple of things. First of all, you may notice in the top right that this session is being recorded. It will be in its entirety shared among stakeholders. So afterwards, if there's anything that you'd like to come back and review, that will be an option that will be made available to everybody. Now, as we begin, I would also like to start by acknowledging the fact that we here are meeting on Treaty 8 land. This is the traditional territory of the Cree, the Dene, and the unceded territory of the Métis, as well as an ancient gathering place for many Indigenous peoples for thousands of years. We're here discussing labor. We're here discussing our region and our prosperity. We're also here to express gratitude today for the provisions of this land and what it has brought to all those in attendance. On behalf of all of the stakeholders here, to everybody who has made it into attendance, we thank you. A brief background on what we will be covering today. The Fort McMurray Wood Buffalo Regional Labor Study was initiated in the fall of 2020. This study included several significant components of stakeholder engagement, featuring the implementation of an employer survey, stakeholder discussion groups, as well as one-on-one interviews. It was quite extensive. The project was led by a steering committee that represents different sectors and stakeholders across Fort McMurray and the Wood Buffalo region. Funding for this survey was provided by the Government of Alberta, ATC, Athabasca Tribal Council, and Fuse Social. It was facilitated by Fort McMurray Wood Buffalo Economic Development and Tourism, and a number of groups had stakes in partnering to ensure the success of the survey. That includes the Fort McMurray Chamber of Commerce, the Fort McMurray Construction Association, Keano College, McMurray Métis, NABA, the Northern Alberta Aboriginal Business Association, OSCA, the RMWB, as well as Rupert's Land Institute. I'd like to briefly explain the course of events for this 1-hour session. In a moment, we are going to hand over the presentation to Gurpreet Sidhu Viridi, who is with Applications Management Consulting. Gurpreet will present the findings of this labor survey in detail. Now, following the presentation, there is going to be a time for questions. If you have a question about absolutely anything, if there is some clarity that you require about any aspect of the presentation, or if something was not included that you would like clarity on, this is your option and this is your opportunity to ask that question of any member of the panel. What you'll see on your Zoom feed on the bottom, if you've never used Zoom before, if you mouse over the bottom portion of your screen, you're going to see an icon. It's 2 speech bubbles, and below that it will say Q&A. You can click that open, and there you can type your question. If your question is not directed to any specific panel member or to Gurpreet specifically, then you can simply just type in your question and it will be answered. However, if there is a specific person you'd like to direct it to, then you have that option as well. I'll once more remind everyone that this session is being recorded and will be shared among stakeholders for you to review at a later date. So again, for the last time from me for now, it is our pleasure to have you this morning, and thank you for participating. With that, I am going to hand things over to Gurpreet. Thank you so much for participating. Thank you.
Thank you, Stuart, for that wonderful introduction. I just want to first give a big thank you to all the regional stakeholders who've been involved in this project since fall of 2020. You know, having stakeholder engagement and input from stakeholders throughout Fort McMurray Wood Buffalo has been a vital component of putting together this labor study. And so I just want to reach out from our team to say a big thank you to all of you, of those who have participated throughout the engagement process. Also, just to let you know that, so for my team, while I'll be doing the presentation, I also have my colleagues, so Daryl Howry and Laura Adkins-Hatkett, who are both from Applications Management Consulting as well, and will be available in terms of the Q&A to help with answering questions. So I'm just going to pop up my PowerPoint presentation here and then get started. So as Stuart mentioned, I'm going to be walking through some of the key findings from the labor study. That'll be going through stakeholder engagement, what we heard from stakeholders, an employment outlook, and then going through the labor market study strategy and action plan. So in terms of the engagement summary, there was a few different tools that we used to engage with stakeholders across Fort McMurray Wood Buffalo. We did an employer survey where we completed 245 employer surveys. These were done both through telephone as well as online. We did key informant interviews, which were done early on in the process. We interviewed over 20 different key regional stakeholders. And the purpose of those key informant interviews was to give us a foundation for what some of those key labor market issues are from the perspective of stakeholders who are in the region, and to help kind of give us a foundation as we kind of launched the project. And then over the course of the project, we held several virtual discussion groups. Some of them were specific to certain topics, such as retention and recruitment. Others focused on certain industry sectors. And then we did hold some closer to the end of the process to talk about what some potential opportunities are in terms of addressing some of the key labor market issues that we heard about throughout the process. So in terms of the employer survey, I'll just give you a little bit more background on that. So as I mentioned, we had 245 completed surveys. 188 of those were completed from smaller firms. 26 were from medium firms, and 31 were from large firms. As part of our process, it was important for us to ensure that we had a stratified survey to ensure that we had representation from employers of different employee size as well as by different industry groups. So that's something that we really took into consideration as we were getting our surveys completed. Our overall response rate was 14% of total employers in Fort McMurray Wood Buffalo. So that's the 245 out of the 1,761 estimated employers in the region. And that was representative, the 245 employers surveyed represented about 37,729 employees in Fort McMurray Wood Buffalo. So the surveys completed represented about 48% of total employees in Fort McMurray Wood Buffalo. So this was obviously, you know, there was a lot of information captured through the employer survey in terms of labor market topics, current workforce, and just different topics on the labor market to get perspective from employers. And then following the employer survey, we did launch into discussion groups so that we could dig a little bit deeper on some of the topics that came out of the employer survey. And those discussions and that were reflected in, you know, the work that was done throughout the process. So what did we hear from employers? So in the next few slides, I'm going to talk about some of the key findings. So what we heard, so 28% of employers reported that employees had voluntarily left their company in the prior year. We had an estimated voluntary turnover rate of 4.1% overall for all employers. Some of the industries that had the highest turnover were administrative and support, waste management and remediation, other services, which includes things like personal care services, repair and maintenance, arts, entertainment and recreation, and healthcare and social assistance. So those were some of the industries that reported above average voluntary turnover rates. Occupations with the most voluntary turnover included petroleum, gas, and chemical process operators, security guards and related security services, heavy equipment operators, other professional engineers, and truck drivers. So these were some of the occupations that had the most voluntary turnover. In terms of vacant positions, so employers were asked about vacant positions that they're currently recruiting for. Overall, the vacancy rate in 2020, we've estimated it to be about 3.9% and approximately 3,100 positions. The industry that had the highest vacancy rate in 2020 was accommodation and food services, which was at 19.3%, so quite above the total vacancy rate. Some of the other industries that had above average vacancy rates were information and cultural services, other services, which was 10%, and transportation and warehousing, which was 7.9%. And some of the top occupations that were reported to have higher vacancies included cooks, construction trades helpers and laborers, light duty cleaners, food counter attendants, and crane operators. So a lot of these occupations that were reported in terms of vacant positions were in construction and trades, as well as in accommodation and food services. Those were kind of the key industries where we noticed the vacant positions. So in terms of recruitment, both in the survey as well as throughout the discussion groups, employers did identify different challenges in regards to recruitment. Through the survey, 33% of employers reported that they had difficulty recruiting within the last year. And some of the key themes that emerged in terms of those recruitment challenges was difficulty recruiting skilled trades locally within Fort McMurray Wood Buffalo, difficulty within trying to recruit for some of the lower skilled occupations, both in accommodation and food services, as well as in other services. The need to recruit outside of Fort McMurray Wood Buffalo and the challenges that employers were facing in terms of their ability and capacity to be able to recruit workers and the costs associated with bringing them in and training versus, you know, their desire, if they could, just to find people locally that had the skill sets they were looking for. We also heard a lot about the loss of the Northern Living Allowance and, you know, the challenges in terms of recruiting certain occupations prior to that loss of the living allowance and what the impact of, you know, having that, which was kind of, you know, a support in terms of a competitive wage for some occupations. So skilled childcare workers is one of them. Which, you know, the Northern Living Allowance was helping to support in terms of recruiting, and it was already a struggle before the loss of that, and I think this just heightened that. And then also cost to recruit to rural communities. So, you know, employers that we talked to in rural communities really talked about the challenges of finding labor locally with the skill sets they needed. And then, you know, having to recruit from outside of Fort McMurray Wood Buffalo, you know, the costs associated with that, having to provide higher wages, and also in some cases having to provide housing and food as well. And in many cases, rural communities also have a shortage of housing. So that would just heighten their ability to be able to bring in people to support their business operations. So in terms of retention, so employers were asked about retention strategies with their existing workforce. So overall, among all employers of small, medium, and large-sized organizations, the top two retention strategies were positive work environment and competitive salary. Just to note that large employers also used a competitive benefits package as one of their ways to retain their current workforce. And small and medium-sized employers were actually using work-life balance and flexible work measures as another tool for them to be able to retain their workers. Something that we heard a lot about just with regards to, you know, we're in the middle of a pandemic and how are we retaining our existing workforce. We heard a lot about employers adjusting policies and their work culture to be more flexible in terms of work schedules, increasing more opportunities for their employees to be engaged through work events and professional development, employee wellness opportunities, so giving employees opportunities to focus on themselves. Mental health was definitely a concern we heard a lot about, and employers having to find creative ways for them to engage employees in order to retain them. So this was something that I think was heightened as a result of kind of the economic environment, but more so related to the pandemic and what employers are doing to be able to kind of retain their current workforce. So some of the other things that we heard just in terms of overall themes that I thought is worth mentioning is a lot of employers talked about the struggle of getting people back to work. So through the pandemic, people took time off, people were laid off, people are accessing different government supports. And how are they re-engaging people to come back into the workforce? Demand picking up. So some employers talked about, there's pent-up demand for different services that were put on pause throughout the pandemic. And those have now come full on stream, and they're having challenges in terms of finding workers to help support that demand that is picking up now. Limitations in terms of virtual and offsite training. So, a lot of employers did talk about their ability to kind of pivot to the virtual and offsite training. However, they did talk, in terms of the overall costs of training employees, they did expect that to be higher because it was taking longer to be able to train people versus when it was face-to-face. And then the lack of work experience opportunities, especially for underemployed groups. So throughout the pandemic, a lot of employers were, laying off or doing hiring freezes, and so they weren't really open to, internships or job opportunities to, hire, especially for the youth. And so, how do we re-engage those employers and get them to start working with some of those underemployed groups again in terms of providing that work experience so that we can build up that labor pool again within the region. So this next section that I'm going to walk through is an employment outlook. Within the Fort McMurray Wood Buffalo Labor Study, we have prepared a 5-year employment forecast with 3 scenarios of growth. So we provided a low, medium, and high scenario of economic growth. The variation between the 3 scenarios is largely around 2 of the key sectors, so around mining, oil, and gas, and the tourism sector. So in mining, oil, and gas, in the low scenario, we've largely assumed that no projects are currently underway or confirmed apart from, what's already under construction or operating. In the medium scenario, there is an assumption that many projects do begin with some delayed construction start times. And then in the high scenario, there's assuming that, there aren't any more delays, and a lot of those projects that have a status in terms of starting construction within the oil and gas sector would start doing so and operating over that 5-year time frame. The tourism sector, so this is one sector that, based on our analysis was, hit pretty hard by the pandemic. In all 3 of the scenarios, we have assumed that there would be a period of recovery for this sector. And that period of recovery just varies depending on the low, medium, or high scenario. And the purpose of doing 3 scenarios is that it really gives us the opportunity to show a range of what the different economic futures could be within Fort McMurray Wood Buffalo. And that's important to ensure that, we're providing a robust labor study, which is dynamic and is able to accommodate, what that different economic future might look like within kind of that short to medium time frame. So in terms of the employment outlook, So on the graph on the left, so we're showing kind of that base 2020 employment. So in 2020, we estimated that Fort McMurray Wood Buffalo had 78,000, almost 79,000 jobs, of which about 41,000 of them were assumed to be from the jobs taken by local residents. By 2025, so we have 3 bars to the right in that chart. We have the low, medium, and high scenario for 2025. And by 2025, we're assuming that in the low scenario, there'll be roughly 78,000 jobs. So it's largely consistent with the base. We're assuming that there would be limited growth. It would just be kind of a continuation of what's there today. In the medium scenario, we've projected close to 85,000 jobs. And so this is a change in jobs of almost 7,000 from today, from 2020 to 2025. And in the high scenario, we're projecting approximately 93,000 jobs. So that's roughly 15,000 job increase from today. So just to mention, I think as I mentioned earlier, I think the 2 industries that have the largest impact, so mining, oil, and gas extraction, dependent on how much construction activity has built into those 3 scenarios, with the high having the assumption that there would be the most construction and investment in the energy sector. So that would have obviously the largest increase in terms of the jobs. There's also a variation with the types of jobs. So, in the high scenario, we're typically assuming that because of the greater investment in the energy sector, there would be a larger demand for jobs within mining, oil, and gas and extraction, as well as construction. Whereas in the low and the medium, there is also, a larger demand for jobs in other support sectors. So food, accommodation and food, other services. So those sectors that are really supporting the local population. So in terms of the occupations that would be growing over that 5-year time period. And just as an example, we've put in the medium scenario in this presentation. I think in all 3 scenarios, heavy equipment operators has the largest growth across all occupations, with increased demand. In the medium scenario, this is reflective of about 700 jobs. So the demand for jobs over that 5-year period. So all 3 scenarios have similar expectations for which occupations will grow the most, mostly just with the variation in the amount. But as I mentioned, the low scenario does have greater demand for occupations within the service positions than the other 2, just because of the lower industry investment. And then in terms of vacancies, as I mentioned earlier when I was talking about the employer survey, currently there's about 3,100 vacant positions in 2020. And throughout the forecast, that ranges from about 2,000 to 2,600 over the course of those 3 different scenarios. So it appears to us that the industry is facing the most difficulty getting sufficient labor from the local supply, would be accommodation and food, mining, oil and gas, and construction. So that would be taking a look at what the demand for employment is versus what that local labor supply. So in terms of the labor market strategy and action plan, so the intent of preparing this is to be able to provide objectives and strategies that are really going to be help regional stakeholders in terms of the implementation of this study, to be able to address some of the key labor market issues that regional stakeholders have noted throughout this process. So as part of this, we've developed 5 objectives. These objectives have been identified, as I mentioned, through the engagement process and the issues that have been identified. So objective 1 is to increase awareness and access to regional labor market information. Objective 2 is to align in-demand skills and local training opportunities. Objective 3 is to support for job seekers to access training opportunities. Objective 4 is to build the local labor supply. And Objective 5 is to promote Fort McMurray Wood Buffalo as a place to live and work. So these 5 objectives, from this, we've developed essentially 9 different labor market strategies that align with those 5 objectives. The 9 different labor market strategies have been categorized into 3 groups. So we have labor market information strategies, skills and training, and then local capacity and growth. So those 9 strategies fall within these 3 high-level categories. So under labor market information, we have 4 labor market strategies. So the first one is to maintain a regional labor market committee. This committee, the purpose of this committee would be to guide and advocate for the needs of regional labor or regional stakeholders to support the labor study. This committee will be responsible for monitoring and advocating for the implementation of the labor study. The second strategy is to define shared goals among regional stakeholders. So encourage opportunities for regional stakeholders to collaborate and define goals for the local labor market community. Number 3 is to maintain current regional labor market information. So this is to identify and maintain existing sources of labor market information and develop new current and regional labor market information to support the needs of regional stakeholders. And number 4 is to promote and share labor market information. So develop opportunities to promote and disseminate labor market information throughout Fort McMurray Wood Buffalo. So this strategy is broken out into 2 phases. So phase 1 is to enhance labor market information online presence through existing, social media and existing websites. And then phase 2 is the development of a Fort McMurray Wood Buffalo labor market information website, which would be customized and specific to the Fort McMurray Wood Buffalo labor market community. So under skills and training, we have 2 labor market strategies. So the first one is to align education and training with local needs. So this strategy supports the need for ongoing review of local training opportunities to better support the regional demand for workers. So better collaboration between employers as well as training providers. The second one under skills and training is to increase access to training opportunities. So encourage opportunities for job seekers to access local on-the-job and education training programs. And then under local capacity and growth, we have 3 labor market strategies. So the first one is to develop local capacity to fill jobs. So this strategy supports the needs to develop the skills of the local labor force. This will help to encourage local hiring and higher rates of employment locally. The second one is to increase labor force participation of underemployed groups. So foster and encourage opportunities to increase the participation of underemployed groups. In this case, underemployed groups includes Indigenous, mature workers, newcomers, persons with disabilities, rural population, women, and youth. And through the study, we've heard a lot about what some of those barriers are in terms of underemployed groups. And through the strategy, we've identified ways in terms of reducing those barriers and re-engaging these underemployed groups. The third one on this page is attraction and retention of workers and families. So this strategy supports the ongoing need to attract and retain skilled workers to support the employment demands in the region. Having a diverse workforce is key to supporting the range of job opportunities in both the energy and non-energy sector. So moving forward, we've spent, part of 2020 and coming into 2021, talking to regional employers and putting together this labor study for Fort McMurray Wood Buffalo. The aim of this is really to support the regional labor market community and build on what's currently underway. There's a lot of, speaking to regional stakeholders, there are a lot of programs and services and collaboration and partnerships that are already well underway in the region. I think this gives an opportunity to really take a look at those and build on those that are working, and really use those as a foundation to kind of push this labor market study forward. Part of that will be taking a look, the strategies identified here have not been prioritized. And so part of, the next steps would be is taking a look at those strategies and identifying, which areas you want to focus on, and, who are the stakeholders in the region to best help support that. We have identified that, there's two strategies that probably should, take kind of precedence in terms of the short term. And that would be maintaining a regional labor market committee and defining shared goals among regional stakeholders. That really helps in terms of having an advocate for supporting the implementation of the labor study, and really looking at the shared goals is going to help in terms of prioritizing, where the efforts of regional stakeholders should be used, both in the short and medium and long term. And then building on local labor market capacity, as I mentioned, I think there's already a strong labor market community in the region, and we've heard a lot of enthusiasm from stakeholders in terms of their desire to, build the local labor market community and be able to, have workers locally to be able to support the range of job opportunities. And so I think this would just help in terms of building on that foundation that already exists. As well as supporting collaboration and partnerships. And as I mentioned, I think a lot of that is already happening, but this can help in terms of, refining that, as well as expanding on that, depending on the different strategies that are prioritized through this process. So I mean, and overall, the Fort McMurray Wood Buffalo Labor Study, it's intended to provide the region with a feasible, impactful path towards addressing key labor market priorities and issues as identified throughout this process. The implementation of this strategy and action plan does require a collective effort from regional stakeholders. From our perspective, this isn't necessarily something that one organization can do on their own. I think as we've seen, there's already a lot of collaboration going on in the region. And I think this is just another tool for regional stakeholders to take a hold of and work together in terms of moving this project forward. So I end at that. I'll pass it back to Stuart, I think.
Yes. I was just finding the button to turn my camera back on. Thank you very much for that presentation, Gurpreet. It was extremely informative and certainly in depth. There was certainly a lot to process. Now the time has come for the Q&A session. I'll remind everybody who came on a little bit later into the presentation that if you have a question for any of the stakeholders, including Gurpreet and her team, you'll find the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. If you open that up, you can ask a question there. If there is a specific group that you would like to address your question to, you can specify there. Otherwise, we'll open it up to the panel, and the individual who might be best suited to answer your question will take it on. One thing that had been asked by a couple of individuals was when and how will this data become available to them? So as I'd mentioned at the top, this presentation itself in its entirety will be dispersed to each of the stakeholders for them to share among their membership. So that's one way of getting it as well. You'll find it at the Fort McMurray Wood Buffalo Economic Development and Tourism website alongside the data that was disclosed herein. Available as possible for any individual interested in reviewing the data again. One of the questions, I believe this should be directed towards a member of the Economic Development and Tourism team. This survey was taken during a somewhat unique moment in time for the region, I mean, for the world really, being started at the end of last year. When will another study similar to this one, another labor study for the region, be taken?
Hi, Stuart. I'm Lisa Sweet, for everybody that don't know me on the call. I'm with Fort McMurray Wood Buffalo Economic Development and Tourism, so I can certainly take that question, as we were, of course, this was a collective effort by the entire steering committee, so all of the partners that you mentioned at the beginning, but of course, Economic Development and Tourism did lead the project. We will house it. It's shareable. It's a public good. We will house it on our website, as well as any of the other partners can house it on their website as well. But in terms of labor market information and the studies like this moving forward, this is kind of a baseline right now, and we will be updating it as we move forward. So definitely within the next 5 years, we'll look at this again. Of course, things change. Things changed from the start of this project, at the start of the pandemic, right to today. So we will be updating information of this sort on an ongoing basis moving forward. And I just wanted to note as well, Stuart, I don't know if it was just on my end or if everybody experienced this, but you kind of cut out a little. Your sound did.
Oh, did.
So if anybody missed the location of the survey, or sorry, of the study, it will be choosewoodbuffalo.ca. You can find it on our website. Thanks.
That's right. Lisa, apologies for that. This next question likely will be fielded by Gurpreet from Perry. So going back to the slide with your chart focusing on job growth, to clarify, we're talking about net growth. So that would exclude factors such as retirement and attrition. Therefore, the positions needed are different than the positions represented. He just wanted clarity on that, please.
Yeah, and I'll just, maybe for everyone's benefit, I can just go back to that slide. So I think we're talking about this slide here. Yeah, so this slide is just looking at the change in employment. So from 2020 to 2025. So the change in employment we've put here is just based on a change in employment demand. So these numbers reflected here don't take into consideration changes in as a result of things like retirement and attrition. And I don't know if Daryl or Laura, if you want to add a little bit to that response.
I'm just trying to get my video on. But yeah, I'd like to add just a little bit, because that's a really great question. We do in the report have more information on that gap piece. So in this presentation, we focused on that change in demand. This one is the total demand for employment at the end of the period. And then the occupation one was the change in demand for those individual occupations. In the report, we have the gaps. So that's where we took a look at the supply side. One thing to be aware of course, is if there are more retirements, attritions, or other changes in that supply, then we could see a shift. But assuming, so we have that based on our assumptions from historical and other resources. So there is a piece in there about that you can refer to when the study's up.
Thank you very much. The next question is coming from Todd. He's wondering how willing companies were during your data collection to provide information or participate in the research. Todd recalls seeing quite a few calls for employers to participate in the survey. Was it a challenge to have local employers or regional employers participate and cooperate in providing data for this Employment Outlook survey?
Yeah, and I can maybe start with that. I think that's a great question. You know, we've never had to launch a stakeholder engagement process in the middle of a pandemic. So there's definitely were challenges related to that. And I think, you know, this project was initiated in 2020. And, you know, when we first started the launch of the employer survey, just after that, you know, we went into kind of, you know, provincial health measures, which shut a lot of businesses down. And a result of that, you know, there were some businesses, we did continue to try to collect data during that process, as there were some businesses where employers, you know, maybe had some more time during that time because they weren't fully involved in operating their business. So they were able to kind of have some time to chat with us. But I think overall we found that because, you know, we were kind of competing with the health measures and the shutdowns, as well as trying to complete the survey, that we did extend the time frame. So, you know, originally, I think we were hoping that the survey would be completed by early in 2021. And just because of the shutdowns and the closures, and, you know, there was a lot of obviously pressure and stress on businesses. And so we didn't want to be having to compete with that either. And so we did extend the time frame so that we could find an opportunity to try to talk to as many stakeholders as we could. And as I talked about, you know, we did take a look at our completions by employer size and industry. So we really wanted to make sure that we were speaking to employers that, you know, representative, the diverse kind of employment base within the region. So definitely a challenge, and definitely something we had to take into you know, kind of adapt in terms of our process. But I think extending the time frame really allowed us the opportunity to talk. And when we did have the opportunity to talk to stakeholders, we did find that they were fairly engaged and really wanting to be a part of this study because, you know, it would be helpful for them as well at the end of the day.
Thank you for that. Thank you very much. Our next question is coming from Shivangi. They're asking for clarity on the on one of, I believe it was near the end of the presentation, talking about moving forward. If they could have more information, a little bit more elaborate explanation towards the training and the capacity building as part of next steps coming from this survey data.
Yeah, that's a great question. And maybe I can start on that. And then I don't know if somebody from the steering committee wants to add to it. So as part of the labor market strategy and action plan, we do have a few strategies that are focused on, you know, bringing together regional stakeholders to talk about different labor market issues, which is going to help in terms of developing those collaborations and partnerships. As well as helping to kind of build on that existing capacity. We also have a few different strategies that talk about, you know, skills and training and certain actions in terms of bringing together stakeholders, you know, education, training providers, as well as employers to be able to kind of match up, you know, the demand for skills with what those local training opportunities are. So I think a key part of this is going to be, you know, getting regional stakeholders together to talk about, you know, how they can collaborate on some of these things. And, you know, how that happens and the timing of all that, I think that's going to be part of what, you know, the labor market committee is going to have to, you know, kind of work on in terms of, you know, what that plan will look like. And, you know, Lisa, I can maybe pass that over to your team if you guys want to kind of build on that.
Hi, in terms of a labor market committee, so some of the, Gurpreet said it really good at the end when these objectives have been identified. And of course, there's not one organization that can take on the you know, fulfilling all of the objectives and the strategies. So, and the steering committee that came together to work on this labor study, it's not formalized yet as to if that will be the steering, you know, the committee that kind of is recommended in the strategy to make up a committee moving forward. So this is really a document that is, it's a tool for everyone. There may be people or organizations that have not been involved in the study at all that want to carry some of the strategies moving forward. For our organization, I can speak to the first strategy under the labor market strategy type information around maintaining current regional labor market information. That is something that our organization, for example, will be doing moving forward. We are and promoting and sharing that information. So we are in the process of developing a new website, which will have a lot of that data and information around labor market, as well as economic data and things like that moving forward. Something else that Gurpreet mentioned was that some of our organizations are already doing some of the work in here. So this is a really good, this whole study is really good to kind of reaffirm some of the work that we are doing as organizations, as well as identify like new strategies that we could be doing and new objectives. Some of the work that we're doing through the Place brand initiative for our organization, for example, is really communicating out to the rest of the world, you know, what Fort McMurray, Wood Buffalo, you know, really telling our story and trying to change that perception. And one of the campaigns that we will be doing later this year is going to be focused on livability in the region. So some of that work around marketing to the region, or marketing our region and trying to attract talent. I know that the Place brand has a toolkit for employers that's been developed on how employers can use the images and the presentations and the you know, all of the information within the Place brand to help recruit and attract. So it really confirms some of the work we're doing, and then it identifies some of the work we should be doing moving forward. In terms of that committee, that is something that we don't have finalized yet, and who's going to lead it and who's going to be part of it and things like that. So we're really open to suggestions from the community, and we want everybody to participate in moving the objectives and strategies forward. And I will hand it off to anybody else on the steering committee that would like to elaborate and discuss that more.
I can just add a little bit from the chamber perspective. Two distinct things that we will be doing going forward. One is the team. Stuart, Regan, and Denise are actually working on executing a job fair towards the end of September. Based on requests from a number of our members, and working with them actually on the job descriptions to better understand some of the ticketing, some of the requirements. And it's going to be blended, both virtual and in person, supported by GOE. That's one thing. The second part is we're in process of finalizing policy writers. So we will be reviewing the report in detail and determining where and how we can advocate locally and provincially in tandem with a committee going forward or as a chamber. And those are just two distinct actions that we have coming out from the survey.
Well, thank you, Diana. Thank you, Lisa. I should say the questions are coming in and they're all excellent questions. We will be concluding this presentation at 10 a.m. However, if your question is not sufficiently answered, not to worry, we will take them back and we will ensure that any of the questions that we haven't managed to get to, that we will, and we will respond to them in due course for sure. Thank you so much for everybody's input up to this point. It's been great. Joshua wants to know if more insight could be provided for your critical assumptions. And I'm assuming this is a question addressed to the steering committee, but I suppose, Gurpreet, you may also have insight to this. Factors and forecasting for employment growth scenarios between 2022 and 2025. Are there any critical assumptions that anyone on the panel could provide?
Yeah, and I can maybe, just in terms of our role in preparing those forecasts, I can start on that. So we have made some assumptions. We have assumed in the forecast that there would be a pandemic recovery period. So, you know, as I mentioned before, you know, we haven't really kind of undergone a pandemic or the kind of the economic circumstances that we're going through at this time and that we're still going through. And, you know, over the last year, we've really gotten a better understanding of what industry sectors have been hardest hit and which ones are actually starting to recover. And so within the forecasts, we have assumed a pandemic recovery period. And I believe that's by 2024. And I'll just get my colleague Laura to just confirm that. But so in addition to that pandemic recovery period, we've built some assumptions in. So, as I mentioned, the two key sectors built into the forecasts are mining, oil and gas, and tourism. And mining, oil and gas, underlying those economic forecasts are, we've taken a look at an oil sands project list to take a look at, what projects do we assume that would start construction over the course of the forecast period, and which ones would begin operations. We've also made assumptions around, turnaround employment, just because turnaround does employ a significant workforce over that time period. As well as, as I mentioned, the tourism sector and its tie to accommodation and food has been one of the sectors where there has been a significant loss of employment. And so we have made some assumptions around the recovery of that over the forecast period. Laura, from your perspective, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I think that covered most of it. We did, yeah, the recovery was a big piece of what we were including for all industries. And the one thing I want to add is that that's one of the reasons that we had tourism. One of the reasons we had tourism is one of our main, our key industries, is because given how much it was changed in 2020, we found it was going to have the most unique path forward. So it allowed for us to make sure that we were representing what was the actual expectations for that industry while allowing the other parts of the economy to start to recover.
Excellent. Thank you for that response. Moving on to next steps again, moving forward. There is a question here asking for there to be more information to be elaborated on for aligning education and training with local needs. The question specifically, is this alignment focusing only for high-skilled training situations, or will that be across the board for all employers and all skill level employment?
So I can maybe start to answer that. I think from our perspective, it wouldn't just be high skilled. I think that what we found is, there's obviously a demand for skilled workers in the region, but there's also a demand for workers in some of those minimum wage occupations. And so I think that there needs to be, potentially more alignment in terms of developing skills of the local labor force. So in some cases that might be, expanding on the training programs that are offered through, Keano College. But in other cases that might be, more basic training programs, life skills, pre-employment skills. These would be skills and training that are really going to help to engage and re-engage people back into the labor pool. So I think that when we talk about training and skills and aligning that with the local demand, I think that it should be reflective of, kind of that range of skills that are required by employers in the region.
Thank you. And kind of going off of the back of that question, Scott wanted to know, is there an existing plan to target the service sector, as it is a sector that is somewhat underserved within the region, or is there a plan currently in the works?
So maybe I'll, I don't know, Lisa, if someone from your team is better equipped to handle that question.
I can maybe jump in, Gurpreet.
Oh, perfect. Go ahead.
Morning, everybody. Sorry, it's Vanessa Cheeseman with the Government of Alberta. In reference to that question, I think we are looking at, this is why we did this study, is like we want to identify what are the areas that Fort McMurray is having trouble and where the employers are having trouble. And so this will help us identify some of those gaps that we need to go in and work with employers. And so once we have the full survey, we can sit down, talk to those employers, identify those needs, then we can move forward on projects that can help build those gaps. And we obviously know the service sector right now is having more challenges than others in retention, recruitment, etc. So we're definitely willing to work with that industry. So feel free to contact us also, and we're always able to help you with that.
Well, thank you for that, Vanessa. Speaking of recruitment and retention, this is an excellent question from Richard. So employers have been incentivizing employees to come, stay, and live in the region as well as work. And there's a financial benefit to the RMWB to have these workers work, stay in the region to help build the local labor capacity that was highlighted in this presentation. Has the RMWB been approached about doing something along the same lines as the private sector, incentivizing new workers to come to the area, whether that be financial incentive or any other form of incentive? Would there be somebody on the panel that would be able to sort of elaborate on that question?
Hi, Stuart. I don't think we have anybody here right now from the RMWB. The RMWB was, of course, part of the steering committee and involved in this project, but I don't, the individual, of course, wasn't at that level to speak to that type of a question, so that we can't speak on behalf of the RMWB. So perhaps that's something that can be forwarded to RMWB themselves.
Most certainly. And thank you, Richard, for your question. There will definitely be some follow-up there. Perry asks another one. Going back to the charts, they're all forward-looking. Can you provide insight on the fit with historical trends? For example, the medium scenario shows 7.7% growth over the next 5 years. How does this fit with the previous 5 years, and what drives the difference?
That's a great question. And maybe Laura, I can get you to we did take a look at some of the historical data as well. And maybe I can get Laura to elaborate a little bit on how we how we incorporated that and landed on our base and made our projections going forward.
Yeah, I can speak to that. I can't off the top of my head remember exactly what the growth had been in the last 5 years. I have it, but just not at my fingertips. But we did use the historical growth to inform what we were doing. So for example, the tourism sector, part of how we built our assumptions for that was by looking at the historical change that was coming before COVID and applying that to our current state. So allowing for that recovery, but also incorporating the trends from previous years. And even in getting to our baseline, we had to use the historical growth rates to get there. So we looked at the last 5 years to understand where we should be now, so that we would have a better understanding of where we might move forward. And then, of course, the other one, oil and gas, we had used data that we had about potential projects that were planned for a while and reviewing what is expected to actually occur in the next 5 years and whatnot. So we were really trying to take into consideration information that had been around from before the downturn and the pandemic, and then allow for in the different scenarios, allowing for how much of the recovery would happen moving back towards those assumptions from the historical viewpoint.
Well, thank you, Laura. As the time is now 9:59, as promised, we will be concluding the session promptly at 10. For those questions that have remained unanswered, as I've already mentioned, we will be forwarding them to the right parties to ensure that they will be sufficiently answered. However, if there's anything that you, in participation of this event, still want to know related to the survey, you're encouraged to email info@choosewoodbuffalo.ca, and that will connect you with the Fort McMurray Wood Buffalo Economic Development and Tourism team, and they will ensure that your question is sufficiently answered. I mean, the thing to remember is that this is all about transparency. The point of this labor study was to outline strategies for our region for the next 5 years, and transparency is at the core of this. I would like to say thank you so much to, once again, to Gurpreet and her team for participating in this event. Applications Management Consulting for undertaking this immense survey and gathering this data for us all to review today. Thank you so much. Finally, I would like to thank again all of the key stakeholders in this program, including the funders, the Government of Alberta, Athabasca Tribal Council, and Fuse Social, Fort McMurray Wood Buffalo Economic Development and Tourism, who facilitated this event, and the steering committee partners, which included the Fort McMurray Chamber of Commerce, the Fort McMurray Construction Association, Keano College, McMurray Métis, the Northeastern Alberta Aboriginal Business Association, the Oil Sands Community Alliance, Rupert's Land Institute, and the Regional Municipality of Wood Buffalo. I would again like to say thank you. We are so grateful that you chose to spend an hour of your time internalizing this information. It will be available to you today through numerous sources, including, of course, through the Fort McMurray Chamber of Commerce. We are going to ensure that it will be made available through all of our platforms as soon as it's ready for us. Have an excellent morning. Have an excellent week. And I'm sure we'll speak again very, very soon. Thank you.